All right. Before we start talking about Teddy Roosevelt, there's two little sections in the book that you need to read on your own to make sure you get the complete picture of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency as a progressive president. Take a look at page 666 on what Roosevelt did to bust the trust, and then take a quick look at just page 667 on how Teddy Roosevelt settled the coal miners' strike during his presidency. Come back to the video when you've got that done. All right, Roosevelt progressivism at its height. Let's first look at Roosevelt regulating the railroad. Roosevelt comes out of his first term as president, the one he finished for McKinley, with a mandate, in his opinion. He wins the 1904 election by a large margin and feels that the voters have given him a mandate to be bold, to go out and do the things that he has said he's going to do. In 1903, towards the end of his first term, Roosevelt and Congress had passed the Elkins Act. This was an act that gave more power to the ICC. It allowed the Interstate Commerce Commission to do things like prohibit rebates by the railroad companies. However, it's a compromise. It was agreed upon by the railroads. The railroads aren't too upset with the Elkins Act. Now, an emboldened Roosevelt and Congress in 1906 passed the Hepburn Act, which allows the ICC to set maximum railroad rates. The government, through the ICC, can determine the maximum amount that the railroad companies can charge. In fact, the Hepburn Act allows the ICC to regulate almost all railroad activity, and the ICC can only be stopped by the court system. In other words, the Hepburn Act makes the ICC and the government's ability to regulate the railroads much, much stronger. Another important area that Roosevelt helped to regulate or improve would be in food and drugs. And it starts when Roosevelt read Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. And Roosevelt, after reading this book and being disgusted by the conditions he learned about in the meatpacking industry, demanded congressional action. The public also read this book. It was a very popular book. And in response, the public stops buying meat. So it's actually the meat industry itself that asks Congress to regulate them. The meat industry comes to Congress and asks for a reform law so that the public will regain their trust. And out of that, we get the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which created sanitary meatpacking guidelines and created government inspection of meat. And through that, the meat industry regains the public's trust and people start buying American beef again. Another problem that the progressives were concerned about were patent medicines. These were miracle cure-all elixirs that might have been sold over the counter or out of the back of a wagon by traveling salesmen. And a lot of people were suspect as to what was really in these patent medicines. And a muckraking journalist by the name of Samuel Hopkins Adams wrote many articles on them, and what he claimed and what he exposed them to be was actually alcohol or even worse, opium. So these patent medicines would make people feel better, but they were actually getting a lot of people addicted. Dr. Harvard Wiley, who worked for the government in the Department of Agriculture and had access to laboratories where he could do experiments, produced evidence confirming what Hopkins Adams had claimed in his articles. It's not long before the American Medical Association and Teddy Roosevelt join with these two in pushing for real solid reform. And Congress responds in 1906 with the Food and Drug Act, which says that food and medicine must list their ingredients. And that leads to the Food and Drug Administration being created to oversee the enforcement of the Food and Drug Act. Another progressive area where Roosevelt gets a lot of credit is in conservation. Sometimes Roosevelt is considered the first modern environmentalist. He was an avid outdoorsman and hunter. He really wanted to use nature, not just preserve it, not just set it aside, but give people access to it. So, for example, the coal and oil reserves that are on public land should be used, or at least be available for the public's benefit. He wants to make places like national parks open for visit to the urban masses. And to do this, he works closely with a man named Gifford Pinchot, who's head of the Forest Service. Together, they create the Federal Reclamation Service, which works through the Department of Agriculture. In 1901, they set aside 45 million acres. By 1908, they set aside 195 million acres that year to be part of the lands that were not going to be developed for commercial or residential or industrial use, but set aside as either national parks or national forests or other things along those lines. Roosevelt also convened the National Conservation Congress. This was a meeting of world leaders to discuss environmental issues. And also, he creates the National Commission on the Conservation of Natural Resources to look after water, forests, land resources, and minerals.